is which security guarantees are they agreeing to? Are they agreeing to all of the proposals for the security guarantees? That includes European troops inside Ukraine as part of ensuring that the ceasefire holds. Well, the Kremlin has never agreed to that. And in fact, they've always said they will attack if European troops are inside Ukraine. Are the Russians agreeing to Ukraine getting significant military aid from the West to maintain its defenses against any future invasion? Are the Russians agreeing to U.S. involvement in the security guarantees overseeing air power? Or are the Russians merely agreeing to, and we already knew this, they're merely agreeing to monitoring arrangements of the ceasefire, which could be considered security guarantees. And we know that last week, that's what President Zelensky was focused on, that while the political track of the talks was not going well, the military track was making an advance on the monitoring arrangements for the ceasefire. So if I don't have details there, I'm like, okay, it's limited in terms of what I can say in terms of the significance. But then I've got a wider question, which is, why does Mr. Budanov say this now? My immediate reading of that, and I'm happy, be interested if viewers come in and give me their perspective on it, and if you gave me your perspective on it. But my reading of it is that this is Ukraine trying to bounce Russia, or maybe more accurately, put Russia in a corner, which says, look, you've agreed to security guarantees. So if the Russians then come back and say, either as part of their propaganda or say in the talks, no, we don't agree to the security guarantees. We've never agreed to this. This makes them look like the bad guys, right? So, you sort of set this out that Russia has made a compromise just for the possibility, or maybe even the expectation, that when the Kremlin does not compromise, again, the Americans back you. The Americans don't just simply say, oh, okay, the Kremlin has rejected this and we're going to accept Russia's line.
That's really interesting possible mind games and negotiation tactics between both sides. And also, despite the big war in Iran, in the Middle East, Russia and Ukraine still expect planned US-led peace talks to happen probably in Istanbul, according to Bloomberg. What are your expectations? Because many analysts and media reporting say that this could be like make or break moment. Last meetings before we have any kind of outcome.
I would be really surprised if we get that type of meeting, especially a significant meeting. Look, what's happened in the I'm speaking to you on a Monday, so what's happened since Saturday with the Israel-US war, and it is a war on Iran, that completely changes the dynamics. I mean, just think of the comparison. When I'm talking to you last week, I talked to you and Sophia on Thursday, we were in the midst of Donald Trump's envoys. Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner were in Geneva. Now they were talking to Ukrainian officials, including Rustem Umerov, the lead Ukrainian negotiator, about the possibility of more talks. But Witkoff and Kushner were also there talking in indirect talks with Iran. So they were trying to do two things at once. Well, what's happened since then on the Saturday is the Trump camp have decided to go with this war on Iran to try to break the regime or force it to accept American demands. And when you're in the midst of waging that war, because the regime is not surrendering, we know that from its retaliation today. If the regime's not surrendering, you've got to devote a lot of your military and your political effort to handling that war. You can't then go off and say, oh, here we are, now we're going to go over and mediate these talks between Ukraine and Russia. Again, especially if you think those talks are on the verge of a breakthrough. So now I think this is spin. I think this is spin that, oh, yeah, we can all get together, we can all meet. The war in Iran doesn't affect us. No, the war in Iran does affect us. It affects so many things we could talk about. It affects the price of oil. It's dramatically affect European gas prices today. It is affecting the U.S. military posture. So therefore, it is going to affect where the Americans, what they're capable of doing and what they're willing to do in terms of trying to get a Ukraine-Russia settlement.
We just began talking about the war in Iran, so let's do some deep dive and analyze this big war in the Middle East. And let's cover also Russia's position. Russian dictator Vladimir Putin says that, quote, this was a cynical and not moral attack against the supreme leader of Iran. Is this war beneficial or harmful for Russia, Putin's regime? You just mentioned about oil prices went high. However, Iran is a close ally to Russia and provided Russia with critical tools, Shahed drones, and some interesting electronics. And with this scheme, how to build Shahed drones en masse. What is your take on that?
Well, first of all, let's just highlight the hypocrisy of a Russian leader who, remember, is wanted for war crimes over the deportation of Ukrainian children, whose forces have carried out mass killings of civilians in Ukraine, whose forces have carried out mass executions, or carried out executions of Ukrainian POWs, whose forces have, of course, invaded a full-scale invasion of Ukraine for more than 4 years. And then that same Russian leader says that the US and Israel attacks are cynical and not moral. Well, yeah. And guess what, Vladimir? If we're going to talk about cynical, immoral attacks, let's hold up a mirror to your face. Yeah, okay, that's no surprise. I mean, the Russians are going to sit there and pose as being the defenders of peace and the defenders of those who have been attacked when they have created war and when they have attacked people relentlessly. What does it mean in terms of practice? I mean, the Russians are indebted to Iran. They're indebted to Iran for, as you mentioned, the mass production and supply of those Shahed kamikaze drones at a time when Russia had not been able to develop their own drone production. They're indebted to the Iranians for helping them get those production lines in Russia started and developed. So Russia's not going to walk away from Iran, especially because beyond the military support, Iran's one of the few political supporters of the Russians in the world. Russians are largely isolated. So Russia, which at one time had, Putin at one time had a tactically close relationship with Benjamin Netanyahu. I've actually written about it. In 2015, they had a huge agreement in terms of how they would handle the Middle East. Well, that's long gone. The Russians are now turning against the Israelis, and it's now like, okay, we're going to defend Iran, both in terms of the PR, the posture that we defend victims, and then also because we're going to protect our political and military position. I don't think the Russian, line is going to make that much difference for the course of what happens in Iran and indeed the region in the next few days. I think the Russians are largely powerless, to be honest with you, as is most of the international community in the face of the US-Israeli attacks. Nor do I think what's happening in Iran is going to have that much immediate effect on the state of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. However, it could have one significant effect that I think could play out, and that is the rise in energy prices. And here we're looking at oil prices had already gone up by around about 15% since Saturday. Then we're looking at European gas prices today, in part because of the general expansion of the conflict, in part specifically because Qatar has just halted production of liquefied natural gas because of a drone attack. European gas prices have jumped almost 40% today. So like almost 40% in a few hours. Well, that type of rise in oil prices does two things. First of all, it puts pressure on European economies. And of course, Europeans are a big supporter of Ukraine. It puts pressure on European economies at a time when they're trying to completely get away from Russian oil and gas supplies by 2027. And secondly, in the meantime, it raises questions about whether the sanctions will prevent Russia from reaping profits from these increased oil and gas prices. This is where the cap, for example, on oil at $60 per barrel comes into play. That if the oil price per barrel is now around $72, $73, which it was last time I checked, that means, Russia potentially could break the cap and pick up a lot of badly needed revenue for its military effort. It's probably going to be a question of how long the U.S.-Israeli war goes. If it stops in the next few days, not much of an effect if it continues and if it expands, especially with attacks on the Gulf states, then that's a serious disruption to the energy markets, and it is something from which the Russians could profit.
You just also mentioned about sanctions and this oil price cap. We also should cover another development because France and Belgium have seized a Russian shadow fleet tanker in the North Sea this weekend, according to a statement made also by French President Emmanuel Macron. And this was joint French-Belgian operation. President Zelensky welcomed this step and this success. What is your assessment of this operation, and from your perspective, could we expect another seizures of Russian oil tankers, shadow fleet?
I think this is a big question, and I'm glad you've raised it. There sort of was a door that was opened up by the Venezuela operations of the United States, because as the Trump camp tried to get the surrender of the regime in Caracas, they've been seizing tankers carrying Venezuelan oil or trying to load Venezuelan oil. And that included seizing a Russian flag tanker a few weeks ago up between Iceland and Scotland. Well, that precedent of just going in and seizing tankers, you look at what the Europeans could do. So like France and Belgium get a hold of one tanker in Russia's shadow fleet. What about other European countries? What about the UK, for example, with its Navy? Could you actually tighten the restrictions on Russia by preventing it from being able to move oil? So yeah, potentially very, 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 very significant. But it raises the question of the military resources these countries have to track and seize the tankers. And it raises the question of political will, because the Russians will claim they're the victim. They'll claim, what? Why are you doing this to us? We're not doing anything wrong. Do you have the political will to stick with this? Especially when you can guarantee a couple of countries within the EU, Hungary and Slovakia, are probably going to object.
Don't you think that this could be seen by Russia as possible warning, possible message sent to Russian dictator Vladimir Putin by European nations? Like, we can't do this if you continue this war against Ukraine, because we have not seen major seizures of oil, like Russian oil tankers and mass tens of tankers, because we know that this shadow fleet consists of probably not hundreds, but 1,000 vessels in this shadow fleet carrying out and transporting Russia's seaborne oil. Do you see this as a message to Russian dictator Vladimir Putin?
I think it's not only a message to Putin. I think it's a pragmatic step in terms of what you do. Look, when we talk about sanctions on Russia, we primarily are talking about economic measures. Right? It's like, okay, we're going to try to, limit exports. We're going to limit imports. We're going to cut Russian banks off from the international financial markets. And that's all well and good. But what you're talking about here is something that goes beyond economic measures. These, in fact, are military measures, right? So this is a military enforcement of the sanctions. And that raises it. When you're willing to put your military in there because you're willing to risk a clash with the Russians by doing it, this is where Europe needs to be positioned. I mean, they've passed 19 packages of sanctions. They have tried to put limits on Russian oil. They have tried to say we're coming out of all purchases of Russian oil and gas by 2027. But if Russia's going to continue to ship oil, getting around the sanctions and finding customers for that oil, what do? You have to cut off the source. And what's the source here? It's the tankers. They're the ones that are carrying the oil. So I think this is a logical step. And if you actually read the statements, both in terms of European leaders who have favored the tightened sanctions and of President Zelensky, this is what they've been hinting at. President Zelensky has been hinting at Europe, take stronger measures against the shadow fleet. Well, what does that mean? That doesn't just simply mean putting these vessels on the sanctions list. It means actually enforcing the sanctions list by seizing the tankers and saying you're operating illegally.